can
the cake.
play. Yeah, the cake.
I think we're gonna get started. We're past our start time here. Appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Tonight we've got Russ, Dr. Wizard. I didn't realize people call you that, but I asked somebody at Airbus, and that is actually the case.
Mr. Wizard.
Mr. Wizard.
I don't have a doctorate.
There's still time.
Yeah, I've known you for a long time. You've been in the industry. I remember actually when you were at Hawkeye, helping get that initiative off the ground.
Yep.
And so, a little bit about the International Space University. We've got a master's program in Strasbourg, France. We have a summer session program that's going to be in Houston this summer. It's an international interdisciplinary program. Great for people just starting out in the industry if you're wanting to do the master's program. Otherwise, the summer session program is geared more towards people that are mid-career. So if there's a few more pieces of pizza back there on drinks, but without further ado, Mr. Wizard.
Yay.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I can see that there's a few of us in this room that will identify with the beginning part of my talk. I became part of the space age in 1969. I was a participant in the Apollo program. I should have said, I'm going to show a slide because I've got a picture of my participation in the Apollo program, and it's a photograph of the Earth, and you could see New York in the photograph, and I was in my apartment in New York, so I participated in that Apollo photograph. So dang it, I am part of the Apollo program.
Count it, yeah.
At the ripe old age of 3. But as you can imagine, that was a significant emotional event, even for a 3-year-old. I've got distinct memories of the liftoff, of Neil Armstrong coming down, of all the different Apollo missions that went through, watching the lunar rover do its thing, and playing golf on the moon, using a map to repair a fender, all sorts of great stuff. And then watch the Apollo-Soyuz mission go up, watch Skylab go up, watch Skylab come down, so that we could have a space shuttle to go service the space station that we just let deorbit. As a 4th grader, I found out that you could send a letter to NASA saying I would like a copy of the Skylab reports, and the next thing you know, I have 3 mission reports at my house from NASA for the 3 Skylab missions. So it was pretty exciting times, but my first love was aircraft, airplanes, aviation. My grandfather was a pilot. He was a World War II pilot, then a commercial pilot. Instilled in me a love of aviation. That, and I had a Corsair model airplane hanging over my bed. So Apollo and the Corsair are the 2 things I remember as inspirations as a child. Then I went through my dinosaur years. So when I got to college, I was going through aerospace engineering at Mississippi State University, and decided I would follow my grandfather's footsteps and I would go Air Force. So I joined the Air Force ROTC program as a freshman at Mississippi State. And then I applied for and received a pilot slot to be a pilot in the U.S. Air Force upon graduation. But I kept my aerospace engineering degree. Most of the students at that point in time, as soon as you got your pilot slot, you dropped your engineering and you went into underwater basket weaving or general business or something where you didn't have to do anything and still graduate because you're going to go be a pilot, and what else did you need? I was a little bit more risk averse, and I said, well, if something happens and I can't fly, I need something to fall back on. So I stayed the course in aerospace engineering, graduated in 1988, And at that point in time, the Air Force had this wonderful program of a no expense paid vacation from the DoD for up to 12 months. So basically I graduated, I was commissioned, and I had no rights, no privileges, no authority, and no income from the US Air Force. So I got my very first aerospace engineering job as a flight design engineer at Mississippi State University's RASTA Flight Research Center, teaching the Honda Research and Development Company how to design, build, and flight test all composite airplanes. And so the Honda jet that they build in the Carolinas right now, we taught them how to do that. And it was in that program that I really learned what it meant to be an engineer. And it kind of set me up for where I went forward in my career, because I had to live with my design. Not only was I doing the design work, but once we had everything done, the first thing I had to do was design the aileron control system for this composite wing that we were building. And I had a fixed location for the bell crank. The size of the aileron was known, and the yoke was a fixed location in the fuselage. I had to figure out everything else out. So my partner and I, we worked this, and we were so proud of ourselves. 2 weeks doing all this stuff, doing mock-ups, learning how do you attach steel brackets to Kevlar ribs, and all that fun stuff. Went to the lab director, showed him all of our calcs, showed that we were well within the factors of safety. We've done all our homework, and we're like, yeah, we're engineers. And the lab director took a look at it and said, okay, that looks good. It looks like you did everything correctly. Go build it. I was like, excuse me? Yes, go downstairs, build it, and install it in the airplane. That's what you do here. And it was at that moment that I learned what it meant to be an engineer, because I had to suffer with my design. And let me tell you, I sucked as a designer, at least for my manufacturability, the install perspective, and if, God forbid, we had to maintain any of that stuff. It was a big eye-opener for me to think things through and understand what are the unintended consequences on multiple orders when you do something. And so that kind of framed my worldview as an engineer. The Air Force finally called me up. I went to Columbus Air Force Base, started flying jets, graduated from the T-37 program, went into the T-38 program. I have flown faster than the speed of sound. It was completely uneventful. We did it in the cloud, so I was on instruments the whole time. He's like, yeah, look at your airspeed indicator. We're doing Mach 1.17, which was about as fast as a T-38 could go. I was 2 weeks from graduation. I was going to fly KC-10s at Barksdale Air Force Base, and all of a sudden, I was failing out of pilot training. And it was because my formation skills in the eyes of the instructor pilots were only fair, not good. And it was, in 3-foot fingertip, you tend to stay at 4 feet instead of 3 feet. And in 3-foot fingertip, you're literally 3 feet away from the other airplane. And you're doing maneuvers where you're pitching up and you're rolling down and you're doing 90 degrees of bank. So you'll pull up in about a 3 to 4G pull up. So you can appreciate this. You're pulling up and then you roll 90 degrees and then come down, and then you pull up and then you come up again, and then you go to 90 degrees and you come down, and you just keep going up and down like this. And if you're on the wing, you have to stay tucked in at 3 feet away. And then your lead will cross you over from one side of the aircraft to the other. And so as you're moving back and forth, you have to maintain that 3 foot of separation. And in my case, I was doing it at 4 feet, not 3 feet. And that was only fair, not good. Good required end to block. And so next thing I knew, my flying career was a smoking crater in the ground. So thank goodness I got my aerospace engineering degree, because the next thing I know, I had to convince the Air Force that I was worth holding on to. The fact I was an aerospace engineer, check that box. And then at my final meeting with the Air Force 06, who was going to determine what my career was going to be in the Air Force, he looked at me and said, I noticed you didn't request navigator school, to where you could be a navigator or a weapons system officer. I said, yes, sir, that's correct. Why? I mean, you're obviously comfortable in the jet. You can do all the acrobatics, do all the G's, all that stuff. I said, sir, I do not want to go through my career knowing I can fly the jet better than the Yahoo up front. And he looked at me and goes, I can respect that. And then I explained to him what my background was, the classes I had taken, my experience at the flight lab. I said, I think all this stuff makes me a good candidate for Space Command and going into the space workforce. He agreed and basically said, keep him in the Air Force, select undergraduate space training. And next thing I know, I get a phone call. It's like, what do you want to do? I said, well, I was reading Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy, and there's a paragraph in there where Sunnyvale Air Force Base, or Air Base, Blue Cube, and the guy saying, yes, sir, that's definitely a Russian anti-satellite moving in on our keyhole, blah, 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 blah. I was like, that's what I want to do. That sounds cool. I want to do that. So they selected me to do that, but it was not the cool classified stuff. It was the Discus 3 satellite system, which was a cool little communication satellite, but that was my introduction to the space world. Went through space training in Lowry Air Force Base in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado, which is now a big community center, I think.
Yeah.
But it was, for me, it was a kind of like a mini master's degree, because it was just basically going back into a lot of the courses I'd taken in college, and a couple of I hadn't. We were doing hand-calculated coordinate transformations, so doing all the matrix work to go from one coordinate system to another coordinate system, because the thinking back then was, you don't have to do the math, but you have to understand the math enough to be able to evaluate what the computer spit out, was that a reasonable number. And if it was reasonable, then chances are it's correct. Because if it's not going to be correct, it usually becomes unreasonable. But if you don't know what is and is not reasonable, you can't evaluate. So we did that. Flew Discus 3s, launched Atlas E's. The very last Atlas E we launched, these were 1959 to 1961 era ICBMs that they converted to be space lift vehicles. The last one we launched, Atlas 45E, was actually on the Smithsonian's inventory list, and we took it back. Launched that into space with essentially a colostomy bag because it was leaking kerosene. Because these were former ICBMs, they had shaft brackets on the outside of the rocket body itself, and you would put a chaff canister on there because in the 60s, the Russians had anti-ballistic missiles. And so all of our missiles had chaff dispensers to confuse the radar so that they could get their bomb on target before they got blown up. In this case, we had a fatigue crack around the rivet that was holding the bracket onto the skin, and an Atlas, at the time, Atlas, even up to the Atlas IIs, they did not have an independent tank. The skin of the rocket was the skin of the tank. It was the walls of the tank. You would have a hemispherical top bulkhead and a bottom bulkhead, but the sides of the LOX tank and the sides of the kerosene tank were the skin of the rocket. And that's how they were able to keep it so lightweight and be able to have so much throw weight for very immature technology that they had in the late 50s. The Atlas rocket did not have enough strength to hold itself up if it was not pressurized. It's basically a flying beer can. And if the beer can's shaken up, you can stand on it, but as soon as you pop that thing open, you can crush it in your hand. That was the Atlas rocket. So we had it stretched and when it was on the pad and unpressurized. But this particular one, the crack in the chaff bracket, we brought in the specialist and he looked at it and he said, well, I can try to fix it, but I'm afraid if I try to fix it, I'm just going to make it worse. So we all kind of looked at it and we came up with the conclusion of, well, all we really got to do is keep the kerosene from making it to the rocket exhaust until it gets up and going, and then it's all going to be blown away. We should be fine if we just kind of collect it. So some surgical tubing, duct tape, and a Ziploc bag we affixed to the side of Atlas 45E, and we launched a DMSP, a weather satellite, into orbit, and it worked just fine. So we found the path to yes. We were faced with an obstacle, and instead of saying no, we found a path to yes. And this is going to be a continuous theme in my career, is finding that path to yes. So from there, I left Vandenberg, came to the NRO, first NRO assignment number 1, and I was in Chantilly in the SIGINT Directorate and got one of the best jobs in the world, where I led a team of about 18 people, a mix of contractors and enlisted folk. And we would go out and we would find real world versions of threat systems, be it radar or communications. We would find real world versions of those systems, negotiate for the use of those systems, bring a far field monitoring system to record what those systems were doing, and then operate those systems in a very prescribed way, documenting exactly what we were doing, when we were doing it, with a GPS locate. We had pluggers, we had actual US Army pluggers with us. And we would then compare all of that to what the NRO SIGINT systems heard as they came over going against that cooperative target. And by doing that, we were able to ferret out all sorts of weird things that they had been seeing. But unlike imagery, you can't just look at the product and say, oh yeah, we missed it by 100 meters, or oh, that's fuzzy, or oh, there's clouds. With SIGINT, did you not hear it because it was off? Or did you not hear it because something's wrong? And you don't know, so you need that cooperative emitter to help you understand that if this thing is broadcasting, I know I will hear it because I've done it before and I've got everything I need to do to be able to process that particular threat system. So we did that and we ran around. We would go anywhere necessary in the world to do that. I've been to some very strange places to do that, and it all worked. We had one system, it was a high threat system to US and Allied pilots. We'd never been able to get an accurate geolocation. It was basically just this big smear of isochrones across a hemisphere. And we went and operated, we were able to obtain an actual threat system of this particular signal. We operated it, we collected the ground truth, got it to the engineers, they compared it to what they were seeing, saw what they were doing wrong, and in a 24-hour period, we went from never geolocating it to geolocating the one we were testing, and then later that day, we were locking them up across the globe. And it was just absolutely freaking phenomenal to be able to see exactly what we were doing, because we were keeping our folks alive by doing that. So the best job I ever had was being able to have that immediate impact on our ability. And it would be things where I would have to fight with the Nellis management, because out on the Western Test Range, at that point in time, they were busy with these other programs that carried much higher priority than this little upstart Air Force captain coming out saying, well, I can't really tell you who I work for, but I need your threat systems. And oh no, we're using our threat systems with this other program that I can't tell you what it is. And that's when we found out that Naval Air Weapons Station, or Naval Air Weapons Center, China Lake, they have an electronic combat range, and it wasn't used nearly as much as the Western Test Range at Nellis. And I could get 3 radars for $20,000 an hour. And I was going out there mostly because, as an Air Force captain, when they referred to you on the radio as Captain Matijevich on a Navy base, you get anything you ask for. But you don't understand, in the Navy, the rank of captain is an 06, so 3 grades higher than a mere Air Force 03. But it was a whole lot of fun. But they were good people, very energetic, very happy to do things in weird ways. And they had a centralized far-field monitoring station that could collect anything that we were doing. So we did some great stuff out there as well. We were working on a processor that would actually fingerprint a radar, so that if you saw the same exact model radar, you could say, okay, was that tail number 1, or is that tail number 2, or is that tail number X? We proved that we could do that, and then we started using that technique out in the open oceans, tracking Iranian submarines, Chinese submarines, Russian submarines. You could be tracking commercial ship traffic, all sorts of stuff like that. In fact, we confirmed an intercept where they named the submarine. We confirmed that the linguists had made a mistake because the name that they claimed was returning from to port was actually a different one based on just the radar signature. And before we could get that report out, they issued a correction saying, oh, we translated wrong, it's actually this. So that stuff worked and was used in the early days of Afghanistan, where there was a threat radar that they were worried about and they were going to take it out, but they needed to find out, is this in Afghanistan or is it in one of the neighboring countries that were sort of letting us do what we were needing to do? And they weren't able to do that, to figure out which one was which, until they used my processor. Basically pumped the data into the processor, and the processor said, okay, here's who everybody is. And they were able to confirm that, oh no, that technically wasn't Allied radar, so don't bomb it. So again, we were doing stuff that people said was impossible. There's too much ambiguity, too much radar reflections, all these things. But my team and I, we found the path to yes, and got things done. From there, I got hand-selected by the director of the NRO to go to Europe and be their representative, their senior representative to the U.S. European Command. In that capacity, we were going through basically the 9/11. I got there in August of '01. In September of '01, everything changed, and so we went into full-on. How do you prosecute a war where you don't really know who the enemy is? You can't identify the enemy out of a room of 100 people, and you know that they're out there. You can't figure out which one it is. So we concentrated on Africa, and we concentrated on the Balkans. During my time in Chantilly, I actually spent a whole lot of time in the Balkans doing weird things in that little joyous part of the world. So I kind of understood what we were up against. So that helped me help the command get better collections for them. And then I was routinely angering the J2 because I worked for the J3. And so I would give him, basically, I wouldn't hold anything back. Say, okay, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do from space. And if we can't do it from space, you're gonna have to do it with some other asset, either an aircraft or people on the ground or something. And I got sideways multiple times with the J2 because that was not part of what she wanted to be saying. But it was the truth. It's what the ops guys needed to know so they could have the right resources to keep people alive. And that's just, that's another constant theme with me. I then got held over in Europe to be the STO chief and did a whole lot of interesting things within the special technical operations world. So these are programs that some of them you can't even acknowledge exist, but they're classified beyond normal classification where you have to be read into them. They're very special capabilities. They may be a fleeting advantage that if anybody knows you had that advantage, they would evaporate very quickly. So we were doing a lot of work. We had a couple of capabilities that Air Force Space Command had and U.S. Army Space Command had, and we were trying to utilize both. And at the time, General Chuck Wald was our deputy commander. So he was a 4-star general, former deputy chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force for ops, so number 3 guy in the U.S. Air Force. F-16 driver, knew space cold. He took an interest in space. In fact, during his staff meetings, he would throw down pictures of aircraft and ask the officers around the table, what's that? Well, it's an F-16. Yeah, what block? Oh, it's an F-16 Block 40. What's its max payload? 28,000 pounds, okay? Maximum thrust, maximum endurance, you're just rattling off stuff. Throw down a picture of a GPS satellite. What's that? Satellite? What kind of satellite? I don't know. What's its purpose? I don't know. How long does it stay in orbit? I don't know. What orbit's it in? I don't know. And then he would basically rip them all a new one saying, look, we are the Air and Space Force. And if you're going to be a leader in the Air and Space Force, you have to know cold all of our space capabilities just like you knew cold all of our air capabilities. And it didn't matter if it's an F-16 or a C-5 or a B-2. The pilots knew. The pilots knew what all those aircraft were and knew generally what they could do. They had no freaking idea what satellites were doing. And so Chuck Wald knew his stuff, and he came in and basically told me his expectations of anything that we brought in to theater that was an Air Force Space Command asset or an Army Space Command asset. And he didn't much care what the 14th Air Force thought of it or what Stratcom thought of it. It was in the theater for our requirement, and we were going to control it, we were going to plan for it, and we were going to integrate it into our baseline operations when we were going, basically practicing for war. That did not win me any friends at Air Force Space Command headquarters. And in fact, in one of the exercises, I basically said, well, if that Air Force Space Command unit is not mission ready, then I'm not paying to bring it to the theater. As I was funding the airlift. And so they would deploy as they would normally deploy. We had C-17s scheduled, and they were doing real mil-air. And in that exchange, the 4-star commander of Air Force Space Command basically referred to me in one of the staff meetings and said, some O5 in Europe is not going to dictate to me which unit I send to Europe. But hey, I can because I was a warfighter. I was at the Unified Command and I can make that call. Unfortunately, my new J3 had just gotten there. He's like, oh no, it's good training, let you come. You don't understand the history. But we did some great stuff. And for the first time in the history of the program, we installed a special technical operations location within the British Ministry of Defense. And when we were doing these exercises, I had British leadership in our classified teleconferences, and we would have a 3-way call between Stuttgart, the Joint Staff, and the Old War Office in London as we were going through the exercise scenario, getting permissions for us to go out and execute in anger if we were going to do that for real. First time we'd ever done that. And it worked out really well. Had a lot of naysayers, a lot of people saying that's impossible, it's never going to happen. I had the people in charge of the networking system that we're using saying, this is supposed to be an admin system, you're using it for war. And I was like, I don't care, it's the only thing I got. And then their heads really exploded when I said, oh, and by the way, I want 4 systems that I can put in suitcases and take anywhere in my AOR, drop them down, and as long as I have SIPRNet, I can get a TAC lane in and I can go high, and I've got a stow cell anywhere in the command. And they're like, we can't do that. That's impossible. I said, that's a requirement. And to his credit, the 06 in charge of the J39 at the Pentagon said, he's our customer. Yes, this is not supposed to be an operational system, but they are using it operationally. We got to figure it out. So I had a 1-star general consult me one time, or guide me one time when I was complaining about I wasn't able to make any progress, and I kept running into blockades. And he said, Russ, you are finding no people. You got to find the yes people. You got to find the people who are willing to find that path to yes. Because as humans, when we are presented with something new, the easiest thing we can do, the 0 risk thing to do, is to say no. If I say no, I have no obligations, I have no risk, I have no skin in the game. I can just say no and walk away. I can say, that's impossible, and exit the room. Wake up the next day, and I'm just as happy as I can be because there's no weight on me. But there's also no success, there's no reward, there's no impact, there's no change, there's no difference. And in our line of business, if we listened to the people who said that's impossible, we wouldn't have aircraft. Goddard never would have launched a rocket. Neil Armstrong, sure enough, never would have stepped on the moon. And it just goes on and on and on. And so I challenge my team, all of my team, from the CEO up all the way down to the kids fresh out of college. We have to find a path to yes. That is our differentiation. That is what makes us special. And that is part of the cultural divide between the way Americans approach problem solving and other cultures in Europe, Russia, across the globe. And it's not that they are wrong, it's just that they're different. And they move at a different speed. I think part of what we have in America is our heritage. If you look even during the Revolutionary War, for that time period, we were moving pretty darn quick. We were doing things faster than the British could react to us and we were doing things more differently, period. The Minutemen, that concept was foreign to the British military. They could not react to our ability to attack them in these unorganized formations, breaking the rules, if you will. And we've just kept that spirit going as a nation, as a community of problem solvers. How do we go forward and do all these great things? And so now that we're in this new era of new space and accelerated commercial startups, this is becoming even more and more critical. So after my time in Europe, I got sent, I had to pay the penalty for living in Germany for 5 years, and they sent me to Los Angeles, pulled me out of the operations world and said, oh yeah, we noticed you're an engineer, so you're now going to be the chief engineer of the U.S. Air Force Transformational Satellite Communications Program. So TSAT, the other TSAT, not the LaserCon guys, but the Air Force TSAT. It was a $24 billion program that was going to completely revolutionize the DoD network. Much like what Derek Turnier is doing right now with the proliferated warfighter space architecture, TSAT was going to do the same thing, but it was going to do it with 5 geosynchronous satellites, replace the entire DISA network with a full mesh network. And instead of circuits, everything was going to be packetized. So you could use the full bandwidth without any restriction. So if you were top priority in the old days, I would have a circuit to you, and nobody else could use that circuit, even if you weren't using that circuit. And you may have a crisis and you need some bandwidth, but I can't give it to you because it's all going to him because he's top priority, even though he's not using that circuit. TSAT was going to change that because I was going to send this wideband pipe, and both of you could use it, but your packets were at best effort, his were priority packets. And we understand that because that's how the internet works today. That's how cell phones work today. That's how all these managed services work today. TSAT was ahead of its time. When I got there, I was as the chief engineer, I had to mature all of our critical technology. I had to supervise our teams, maturing our critical technology to TRL 6, a year ahead of need. So the FAR said you had to be TRL 6 by a certain milestone. We were told, oh, we're not going to be SIBRs, so you have to be ready a year ahead of time. Again, lots of people saying, no, can't do that, can't possibly do that, that's impossible, it'll never happen. I found the people who said, no, we're going to find a path to yes. And so we were able to say, you know what, we're not going to use Trusted Foundry for this program because you don't move fast enough. I need 90 nanometer rad hard ASICs, even though nobody knew what those were. But we needed some, and we were going to define it, and we were going to make them. But what we were doing was not consistent with the Trusted Foundry program that NSA was telling us we must follow. It's like, well, we can't follow it because you guys aren't moving fast enough. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to implement these best practices of the Trusted Foundry program, but we're going to keep on moving forward with commercial. And so we had an IBM solution out of Fishkill, New York. And at the time, it was Freescale in Austin. It's now TSMC or something like that. It got bought out by the Taiwanese. But we found a path to yes. We found a way to get the technologies necessary so that we could close the loop. Went through 2 separate technology readiness assessments, one by the Aerospace Corporation, the other one by, one by DoD, one by the U.S. Air Force. Passed both of them. So when they decided to cancel TSAT, it was not because we were not technologically ready. We were ready a year ahead of time. It was that the DoD did not want to pay the bill, especially when they found out that the terminals that you would need to get all the benefits of the TSAT constellation would not be ready for at least 10 years. And they said, why are we spending this money on these giant satellites when nobody's going to be able to use them fully for 10 years? And that's because the services are in charge of developing and fielding terminals. The Air Force may be buying the comm system, but it's the Army responsible for buying the Army terminals, and it's the Navy responsible for buying the Navy terminals. So they canceled TSAT. They immediately went to Lockheed Martin and said, okay, we need to buy some additional advanced EHF satellites to cover the gap that TSAT's not going to be there to cover. And Lockheed said, okay, here's the price. And lo and behold, it was the same price we were paying for the TSAT satellites. So we paid the inflated TSAT price, but we got 20-year-old technology instead. So again, that is the challenges that we have in government contracting, especially in the early 2000s. I finally got to the Pentagon as the Deputy Director of Space Policy, and that was where I ended up my career. Because I stood up for what the warfighter wanted instead of what Space Command wanted to hear, I was penalized for that and never made 06. In fact, some of the officers who were very vocal about what myself and my horse could go do during the time I was in Europe, they were the ones sitting on the boards. And so I made 05, and that was as far as I went. As soon as I hit 20 years, I became the most powerful 05 in the Air Force, because as long as I didn't break the law, there's nothing they could do to me. It's like, what, you're not going to promote me? Oh, you've already done that. But we did a lot of great stuff. We wrote the first national space strategy and space policy, and I think, I want to say it's like a decade or something like that. It was a major transformation of that. It was the Obama administration's first term. So we got to go through the entire integration of them coming in saying, we're going to change the world, we're going to change the world, we're not going to do any of those Bush policies. And then once they got the full classified debrief of what was going on, they're like, oh, well, we want to do that. It's like, okay, well, that is Bush policy number 22. Oh, we can't do that. It's like, okay, it'll cost you $100 million to not do that, to do this other thing. Oh, I don't want to do that. And so they were very quickly found out that the problems of the world and our responses to the problems of the world are not political in nature. They're kind of based in reality, and there's only a small, a handful of solutions that will do something for those problems at a specific price point. And that's kind of one of those immutable truths that go forward. So I left the Pentagon, I went into industry, learned a lot of stuff in different companies. I did get a chance to become employee number 7 of Hawkeye 360. And that was the first time anybody started having a conversation of, you can collect signals as a commercial entity? And the answer is, why, yes, you can. We just never have done it in space. We do it on the ground all the time. We do it from the air all the time. But we've never done it from space. And that got people really, really, really concerned. In fact, we got to the point where we were openly telling people we are not doing SIGINT. We are collecting signals and we're geolocating where they are on the Earth. It is not SIGINT. And you can say, well, how can you say that? It's like, well, if I'm a Title X organization, I am collecting signals and I am doing geolocation of those signals, that's electronic support for targeting purposes. That's not SIGINT. And so we were observing human activity and reporting said activity with a latitude and a longitude. And it occurred to me one day, that's the definition of geospatial information. So I started talking to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and said, hey, I think our product is what you need. And it is filling in a gap of observable data that you don't have right now. And it took me about 6 to 8 months and multiple trips to the headquarters and multiple conversations and briefings. But they eventually said, you know what, you're right, that is geospatial information because it's just observable activity with a latitude and a longitude. And so that gave Hawkeye 360 relevance and it gave it a seat at the table. But we were not remote sensing according to NOAA. That was the other thing. Now on the wall, we had a framed letter from the NOAA Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Agency. When we said, okay, we're going to be doing this, we need to get a license, they said, you don't have a camera, you don't need a license. It's like, what? Yeah, we don't consider what you're doing to be commercial remote sensing, so therefore you do not need a license from us. Have a nice day. So we framed that letter, hung it on the wall, and ran forward. Had our brand new partnership with NGA, and the rest is history with Hawkeye 360 and the other companies that it inspired to come along. But again, we were finding paths to yes. Now that I'm at Airbus US, I find myself saying that over and over again because of the cultural differences between what we do in America and what my colleagues in Europe do. Not that it's wrong, it's just different. And we have different views, we have different risk acceptance levels, and we tend to go and do things because we think we can, instead of thinking we can't. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen a lot in industry is you want to go do something, and let's say it requires an investment of $100 million, all right? Doesn't mean that you have to invest that $100 million tomorrow. It means that you have to put aside $100 million or the financing for $100 million, and you put a plan together that says, I'm going to go do these things. A lot of times you'll get pushed back on like, well, what do we do if we lose? Like, if we lose, it's easy. I shut it down. I may lose a couple of $1,000s or maybe $10,000 or $20,000, but that's a gamble I'm willing to take, because the more important question is, what do you do if you win and you didn't prepare? Now you've got this tiger by the tail called SDA, and they're expecting to have something new in space inside of 2 years. And you come from a culture of, oh, it's at least 5, probably 10 years before we can get to space. No, you've got less than 2 years to implement your great idea, have the space qualified, and have it on orbit doing something for the warfighter. Don't be asking, what do we do if we lose? Be asking, what do we do if we win? Because the infrastructure that you need, the capabilities that you need, the talent that you need, you can't just go to Best Buy or Costco and buy it off the shelf. You've got to cultivate these folks. You've got to cultivate the investment. It takes time. If you're building out stuff, or if you're having to change a production line or build a new facility, that takes time. I can shut something off with a simple letter, and yeah, it sucks that I'm out $40,000. But if I had won and then had to default because I can't produce because I wasn't prepared. So that's the challenge. Finding that path to yes is, how do you get to that to make sure you're properly postured? Now, the name of my talk is supposed to be Resilient Manufacturing, and that extensive background and foundation is absolutely critical to resilient manufacturing, because I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you think we're at war right now? That is better than, I'm impressed. Good on you. I've asked that question before, and nobody raised their hand. I said, we're at war. We're in phase 0 operations, and there are adversaries out there that are actively planning against us. They are conducting operations against us. For those of us of a certain age, we can remember the Cold War years. I remember hiding under my desk for an air raid drill, putting a book on my head. You would go into these big concrete buildings, and they'd have these yellow and black signs on the outside that said fallout shelter. And if the alarms went off, you had to get to one of those things and get down below, because there was going to be fallout coming and you needed to seek shelter. It was a way of life. It was mutually assured destruction, but it's still something that you had to prepare for, because we were in phase 0 operations of a Cold War, and we didn't know when or if it would ever go hot. We're in the same situation today, but instead of radioactive fallout that we have to guard against, it's cyber fallout that we have to guard against. I will send you a link to a great LinkedIn post thought piece this one guy put down, that he's seeing this happening over and over and over again. I spoke at a Aviation Week conference a few months ago, and it was the same thing. Resilient manufacturing. We are so interdependent, one company to another, throughout the supply chain, throughout our partnerships, throughout our engagements, and we're all using networks. And we're not really looking at, okay, how secure is your network compared to my network? How secure is your network compared to my network? And we've got case studies from the past where you may have the Fort Knox of computer networks that nobody can possibly penetrate. But if you've got a vendor who has a McDonald's drive-through of network security, Well, guess what? You're no longer secure because someone's going to infiltrate their network and they're going to send something to you that looks legit. And you're going to take that and say, oh yeah, I'm going to go execute that. And there's a chance that that might not be true. And I don't think these attacks are going to be blatant denial of service attacks because that's too easy. We've been conditioned, oh, denial of service attack, I know exactly what to do. The challenge is going to be when they get in your network and they start sending misinformation between people that you trust because, oh, that's Bob from KYC. Yeah, he was working on this project for me. He just sent me the design package. Oh, did he? Or did he send you a design package that's got a bunch of flaws built into it and you didn't detect it? And when I talk to people about this, and I talk to them about resilient manufacturing and resilient industries, they all look at me and say, well, what are we supposed to do? It's like, one, secure your damn network. Two, let's get together and create some sort of federated, let's get serious about cybersecurity, and let's start doing exercises. That's what the military does. They go out and they exercise stuff. Let's look at doing exercises. Let's do industry exercises and see what we can do. Find out where the threats are. And I guarantee you there are plenty of government agencies who would love to be be the red team that comes in and challenges us and grades us and helps us learn. And yes, it's going to cost money. But if you believe that we are going to be in some sort of armed conflict by the end of the decade, we've got to be preparing now. And you've already heard Secretary Kendall say, we are out of time. And the resiliency of our manufacturing, it's not just, am I going to get enough iron to build these 155 howitzer shells? It's coming down to, oh my gosh, is my network vulnerable to somebody coming in and speeding up or slowing down this one particular milling machine that's putting the shape on the howitzer shell itself, causing me to misshape or mismanufacture the latest batch, and now I'm a month behind. And we can look to the Ukraine for inspiration and find out that they go through as many howitzer shells in a month as the UK produces in a year. That's what we're up against. And that's the resiliency in manufacturing that we should be thinking about. In addition to all the other challenges that we have, we cannot lose sight of the fact that there is active warfare going on right now in our computer networks. And most of us do not understand the depth and breadth of what these adversaries are doing. And it could be a militaristic activity, or it could be purely commercial espionage from some of these friends that we consider friends, but when you get into the commercial world, all bets are off and you're going to have all sorts of challenges. And so in closing, what I want to just plead with you is let's come together, let's figure out how we do this. I want to create all these, all of you are now evangelicals of let's go out and figure out how do we secure our networks in a way that doesn't break the bank, but give us a chance to practice it. Practice what we preach, practice the skills, practice how do you do two-factor authentication on a product specification? Has anybody thought about that? Simple things like that. Can you defeat the misinformation by having a gold standard trusted copy of it that you can compare it to? Things like that is what I'm trying to get folks to think out of the box. Find that path to yes, versus everybody saying, well, it's impossible, it's going to cost too much. Is it going to cost too much? Or are you willing to lose the farm? What's the cost of that if we don't prevail? So that's my challenge to you. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm happy to entertain any questions. I'm happy to entertain any debates. I do not believe I have the corner on all the good ideas, and I love hearing contrarian positions. In fact, one of my favorite sayings is, if there are two people in an organization that consistently agree, one of them is unnecessary. So, thank you again.
I'll start with a contrarian question,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So, your resilient supply chain discussion. I heard a lot of concerns about cybersecurity.
Yep.
As kind of the main theme, but I want to push back a little bit because you also talked about scalability.
Yep.
And the UK manufacturing a year, I think, is a decent example. You know, I think a lot of folks are asking, especially post-COVID, especially in terms of spacecraft manufacturing and proliferation.